Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for joining us this evening. I'm Nimer Sultani, and I'm the chair of the Center for Palestine Studies. Today, we mark 77 years since the beginning of the Nakba as a process of mass displacement, cultural erasure, and genocidal destruction. It took the United Nations 75 years to commemorate the Nakba for the first time in May 2023. But as we commemorate the Nakba today, UN committees, commissions, and representatives are increasingly willing to say that we are witnessing another Nakba, another genocide, not only in Gaza, but also in the West Bank. 2 days ago, on the 13th of May, Tom Fletcher, the United Nations Under Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator, told the UN Security Council, quote, "For those killed and those whose voices are silenced, what more evidence do you need now? Will you act decisively to prevent genocide and to ensure respect for international humanitarian law? Or will you say instead that we did all we could?" Unquote. But on Nakba Day, we ask another question. The fact that this is not the first genocide that Zionism has inflicted upon the Palestinian people, and the fact that this is the second Nakba anniversary during this genocide, compels us to ask what more evidence is needed now for everyone to realize the nature of Israel and Zionism. The consensus that Israel is committing a genocide in Gaza and that Zionism is indefensible is increasing because the evidence is overwhelming. In the face of Israel's barbaric crimes, in the face of Zionist mobilization to justify these barbaric crimes and bully Israel's critics who oppose these crimes, in the face of the prolonged silence or equivocation of so many, countless persons of conscience, human rights advocates, health workers, journalists, students, and academic experts spoke up against the genocide that Israel has committed and has been committed. They named it for what it is and have been busy documenting it and seeking accountability for the innumerable crimes that have been committed for so long against so many in plain sight. Our speaker today needs no introduction. We asked Professor Ghassan Abu-Sittah to deliver the annual lecture by the Center for Palestine Studies because he is an inspiration to so many. He not only witnessed the genocide, but he also demonstrated in action the admirable virtues of courage and selfless dedication. Courage is a virtue that was hard to find in so many institutions, organizations, and individuals in Western countries, despite the self-identification with liberal democracy and the guarantees of freedom of speech and the celebration of civil society. In the past 587 days, we saw a lot of horrific and inhumane images coming out of the mass slaughter and mass displacement in Gaza. But we also saw endless and daily instances of heroism and courage by the men, women, and children of Gaza, despite overwhelming odds. Professor Abu Sittah is a courageous physician who decided immediately to do something about the unfolding horror. He arrived in Gaza on the 9th of October to volunteer with Doctors Without Borders. He remained in Gaza for 43 days, working at Al-Ahli Hospital, Al-Shifa Hospital, and Al-Auda Hospital. During that time, he became a powerful voice as he repeatedly described to international media outlets the horror he witnessed while healing the wounded amidst the ongoing destruction and systematic targeting of hospitals and health workers. He then returned to the UK to be elected to the position of rector of the University of Glasgow. He is now a professor of conflict medicine at the American University of Beirut. Some of you might remember that we, in the Center for Palestine Studies, had organized a talk for Professor Abu Sittah at the end of November 2023, a few days after his return from Gaza. But Then we had to cancel it because he felt compelled to return to the region to do more. We also asked Professor Ghassan to deliver this lecture because we want to honor and show gratitude to the selfless and heroic health workers in Gaza, including medics, doctors, and nurses who have risked their lives on a daily basis under unimaginable conditions that can test the best of us. The massacre of paramedics on the 23rd of March 2025 will forever be a demonstration of Israel's barbarism and another evidence of its genocidal intent. Today, we remember Dr. Adnan al-Bursh, Dr. Iyad al-Rantisi, and their colleagues who were kidnapped, tortured, and killed in Israel's torture camps. And we pray for the safe return of Dr. Ghassan Abu-Sittah. The Center for Palestine Studies is honored to host Professor Ghassan because his practice of medicine is not driven by freestanding, depoliticized humanitarianism that shies away from tackling or even naming the cause of suffering. Rather, his practice is committed to the cause of freedom and liberation, dedicated to ending the suffering of the oppressed and the colonized, and thus transcends disciplinary and professional limitations and neoliberal individualism. So today, Professor Abu Sittah will speak for about 45 minutes, and then we will have some time for questions and discussion. So we look forward to your contribution. Please note that this event is being recorded, so no outside recordings are allowed, and please take that into account if you decide to participate in the discussion. Please help me welcome Professor Ghassan Abu-Sittah.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Nimr, for this introduction and for this invitation. Big thanks to the Institute for Palestine Studies at SOAS. In today's talk, I want to try to describe a framework with which we can understand what is happening in Palestine, and particularly this idea of the genocide and how the genocide works. And with that, we want to try to start with two figures. The first figure, which is made of two numbers, around 60,000, and then The Economist recently around 105,000 traumatic deaths, i.e. Palestinians who have died as a direct result of the bombing. And then the Lancet's piece that probably as a result of the genocide, 290,000 Palestinians have died, 14% of Gaza's population. And to try to understand how they are both correct in their assessment of the lives taken during this genocide. The framework that I propose is that of a biosphere. And biospheres are the physical, biological, and social environment that we inhabit. It's an ecology that all of us live in, and that interaction between the physical infrastructure and the biological ecology that we live in, and the social life that we are part of, is what determines human health. And it shapes our lives, and it continues to cause health and ill-health. And I propose to you that what Israel has created was a biosphere of genocide. A social, biological, and physical ecology or atmosphere that now exists inside Gaza, that aims at taking the lives of Palestinians through a multitude of injuring conduits, some of which work independent from each other, while many are synergistic with each other. So to begin with, what are the causes of death in war? And most particularly, in a war where 100,000 tons of explosives have been used on 365 kilometers square. So we can divide them into traumatic deaths, and these traumatic deaths are as a direct result of the explosives, the bombs, the quadcopter bullets, the missiles. And these traumatic deaths should be viewed as targeted deaths that aim to produce a disproportionate effect in the creation of the biosphere, and non-targeted deaths. And as I said, the first Lancet paper put the assessment around 60,000, and recently The Economist said it's closer to 105, with another 10 to 20,000 still under the rubble, and an unknown number of thousands that have just been physically pulverized when a 2,000-pound bomb or a 1,500-pound bomb falls on top of them. The second cause of death is non-traumatic deaths or illnesses. And these are either non-communicable diseases like heart disease, hypertension, diabetes, kidney disease, or infectious diseases. And then the third category is maternal and perinatal deaths. And these are the consequence of the health of the mother, the health of the newborn, and the level of delivery services that ensure safe delivery and safe care of the newborn child. And the biosphere should explain the difference between the traumatic deaths and the total number of deaths, i.e., the total number of deaths is as a result of traumatic deaths, non-traumatic deaths and illnesses, and maternal and perinatal deaths. So traumatic deaths are either immediate or delayed. The bomb falls, the majority are killed outright, particularly in those bombs that are designed particularly to cause maximum destruction. The 2,000-pound bombs, or in the case of Al-Ahli Baptist Hospital massacre, shrapnel fragmentation missiles that killed 483 people in one go. And then the delayed traumatic deaths. And these are injuries that could either survive or die depending on the level of health care that is given to them. So a wound that is otherwise survivable, not finding any hospital, will eventually become a lethal wound. A wound in an individual with comorbidities, who's hypothermic because they're living in a tent, who's malnourished, as is the case in most of the population in Gaza now, has uncontrolled and untreated non-communicable diseases, hypertension or uncontrolled diabetes, because of a lack of healthcare and access to medication, due to toxicity, and the toxicity exists in the destruction of the lived environment, especially the urban lived environment, and comorbidities such as infections, either systemic infections like diarrheal diseases, and so the wounded who have infectious diseases are more likely to die from lesser wounds, and from wound infections, because as we found very early on, these wounds, these war wounds, are so highly contaminated that unless the patients are taken to the operating room within the first 24 hours, the level of contamination then creates infection, and infection then creates sepsis, and the patients succumb to these injuries. We move then on to the non-traumatic deaths and illnesses. So, non-communicable diseases, hypertension, heart disease, diabetes, kidney failure, if untreated, become life-taking diseases. If your hypertension is untreated, you're more likely to develop a heart attack or a stroke. If you're unable to access dialysis services, you're more likely to die if you've got kidney disease. If you have no access to a continuous supply of insulin as a diabetic or oral hypoglycemics as a diabetic, you eventually die as a result of what were chronic diseases that then become medical emergencies. And we saw within the first 3 weeks of this last round of the siege, after the ceasefire was ended, 30 of Gaza's kidney failure dialysis patients died within 2 weeks because they had no access to the dialysis units. The second cause of non-traumatic deaths or illnesses is infectious diseases. And we will talk about how Israel created the conditions where they become a major component of the killing machine. Toxicity, environmental toxicity and poisoning as a result of the destruction of the majority of the buildings in Gaza. And then, as we see now, malnutrition and starvation. So to start out with, maternal and perinatal deaths. So at the moment, between 20 and 50% of Gaza's pregnant women are malnourished. If you add that to a diarrheal disease or a respiratory disease, these women's lives and the lives of their unborn child then becomes at risk. At the moment, 5 women die in childbirth, during childbirth, per month in Gaza, compared to 2 per year before the genocide. And there's been a 300% increase in miscarriages of malnourished, sick, ill mothers who lose their babies as a result of that environment that Israel has created. And that's the first, so the health of the mother, now the health of the newborn. Well, there are no safe facilities. Of all the maternity hospitals in Gaza, the only one left is a single maternity hospital in Sirat camp. Israel, at the very beginning of the war, bombed the maternity wing of Shifa Hospital. And during the siege of Nasser in Khan Yunis, bombed the maternity services there. And so the Auda maternity hospital in Sirat camp, women are given half an hour to be discharged after giving birth because there's just no space. And in addition to the miscarriages, now 20% of children are born premature because these malnourished, stressed women who are living in tents are not able to hold on to the pregnancy for the full term. And then the newborns are subject to the same environmental, infectious diseases, assaults that everybody else is, and the same malnutrition, because the breastfeeding mother is unable to breastfeed because she is malnourished and has infectious diseases and is living in dire conditions. We then go on to the destruction of the physical environment. Well, Israel has destroyed 90 to 95% of all buildings in Gaza, discharging 50 million tons of debris. And that debris is composed of around 200 known carcinogenic, cancer-forming, teratogenic, mutation-forming, or congenital abnormality-forming abnormalities. And so when a building that is detonated, that is 4 or 5 stories high, it releases plumes of not just silica that is inhaled, but the plastics in the building, the copper, the heavy metals, the selenium that made the cement. All of these toxins are then released into the environment. And so when you have 50 million tons of this debris released, you realize that there is a level of toxicity that exists in Gaza that is unseen in such a small place. 80% of all water and sewage infrastructure has been destroyed. And so sewage is discharged into the streets or into the sea. All 6 major wastewater treatment plants were bombed. 85% of sewage pumping stations were bombed. and 640 miles of sewage pipelines were bombed. The physical, in addition to these buildings, there are specific buildings that were then targeted because they have a disproportionate effect into creating this biosphere of genocide. And that is what we've seen in the last 24 hours, the bombing of the European hospital in Rafah, a week before that, the bombing of Nasser Hospital. And so out of the 36 hospitals in Gaza, only 33, out of the 36 hospitals in Gaza, 33 have been bombed and destroyed, causing a disproportionate effect on human life than the other buildings in Gaza. And then when we look at the water supply, well, 85% of all desalination plants were bombed at the very beginning of the war. 67% of municipal wells were bombed. And this meant that there has been a 95% decrease in drinking water in Gaza. Again, creating yet another conduit for creation of illness, for making sure that those who are wounded succumb to lesser wounds, and propagating the infectious diseases by forcing people to drink unsafe water. We then move to the destruction of the biological as a part of the biosphere of genocide. Well, every day in Gaza, 2,000 kilograms of garbage pile up in the streets. There's a daily discharge of 340,000 gallons of untreated sewage as a result of that destruction of the infrastructure. On average, people are able to bathe once every 10 to 15 days. And 70 to 90% of Gaza's agricultural land have been destroyed. Coupled with the siege, that ensures that the famine is able to take hold much more effectively than if Gaza was allowed to continue growing its own food. And then the destruction of the biological, we again look at the targeted killing of health workers. A health worker in Gaza is 2.5 times more likely to be killed or wounded than any other profession in Gaza. So statistically, there has been an intentional targeting to wipe out a whole generation of health workers. And yesterday, one of the senior operating room nurses at Shifa Hospital was killed with his family. And so to give you an idea what effect that has, is that of the 1,100 health workers that were killed, we had 5 pathologists in Gaza. And so you need pathologists to be able to make diagnoses, to run the cancer service, to make diagnoses for surgical diseases, for blood diseases. Of those 5, only 2 are still alive. Of the 3 board-certified nephrologists in Gaza, kidney specialists, none is still alive. There are no emergency medicine board-certified doctors still alive in the Gaza Strip. And so that intentional destruction ensures that even if the hospitals are rebuilt in terms of a ceasefire, a hospital as large as Shifa Hospital, which had 650 beds, can be rebuilt in 3 years. But someone like Dr. Hammam al-Lawh, the board-certified nephrologist, well, it took 6 years of medical school, 4 years of internal medicine, and then another 3 years of nephrology fellowship. Or Dr. Haytham Abu Hani, the head of emergency medicine at Shifa, it took 5 years of medical school, and then another 8 years of specialization. And so you're looking at a whole lost generation of health workers with the aim of ensuring that even if the physical is repaired, that lost generation will take another generation, if not more, to replace. 1,600 kilograms of hospital waste is produced in Gaza every day. And that also goes into reinfecting the environment in Gaza. And as I said, the toxicity from 50 million tons of rubble, of dust, smoke, dioxin, lye, which is drain cleaner, is all in the cement that becomes vapor when it's detonated. 150 toxic chemicals are found in these buildings that have been attacked. And what we've also seen, and this is again goes back into this environment, is as a result of this toxicity, there has been an increase in antimicrobial resistance. And so antimicrobial resistant bacteria is any bacteria that is resistant to 3 or more families of antibiotic. And we know from previous studies that the casing of a lot of these bombs, the cobalt and the tungsten that makes out the outer casing of these 2,000-pound bombs, that heavy metal induces mutations in bacteria that makes them resistant to antibiotics. The selenium that is there in the making of cement also induces the mutations that makes bacteria antimicrobial resistance. So what does that mean? That means that when you have a wound infection, the majority of antibiotics don't work. And those that work, rather than costing $4 or $5 a pack, cost around $200 to $300 a shot. And we now know that 96% of all wounds in Gaza are infected with antimicrobial resistant bacteria. %88 of the environmental samples taken in Gaza contain poliovirus. And infectious diseases, as a result of this destruction of the social, destruction of the physical, destruction of the biological, is now the leading cause of death in Gaza. Infectious diseases, there has been 2.1 million cases of infectious diseases since the beginning of the war, and there are 46,000 new cases every week of diarrheal disease, of respiratory disease, of hepatitis, of polio. And so when we speak about the biosphere being able to work independently and synergistically, we now can see how a wounded patient, one of the 100,000 wounded, if they are malnourished, they're more likely to die. If they have an infectious disease, diarrheal disease, they're more likely to die. And if they have an untreatable wound infection, because the bacteria inside that infection, causing that infection is antimicrobial resistant, they're more likely to die. And so that biosphere creates triads of synergistically acting conditions that take the lives of Palestinians, both wounded and unwounded. If you're one of the 71,000 who've developed hepatitis A affecting your liver, which is the viral liver infection, then your ability to withstand surgery and to form clots that stop you bleeding out in that surgery is adversely affected. We now move on to the malnutrition and the intentional starvation. And I need you to think of that more as an iceberg than just as a basic block. So the visible part of the iceberg is the 57 dead, mainly children, who starved to death. But underneath that iceberg, you have 9,000 cases of severe acute malnutrition that need urgent treatment, i.e. they need hospitalization, 9,000 cases in 3 hospitals left functioning, and there's a further 60,000 that need urgent treatment, including 16,000 breastfeeding and pregnant women. So 20% of Gaza's population now have what is called extreme levels of malnutrition. And again, you see how the triads work. If you're malnourished and you're wounded, or you're malnourished and you have an infectious disease, then at lower levels of malnutrition, you're going to die. But what's even more devastating is that 30% of children have shown acute wasting. And we know from literature going back all the way to the villages in Holland in the Second World War, that children who have acute malnutrition in childhood go on to develop higher and more severe levels of hypertension, heart disease, diabetes, all of the non-communicable diseases that we see. They happen in these children when they're in their middle age, at more severe forms, and at earlier ages. And we know from a paper recently, in the last few years, published in Nature, that the cognitive centers in the brains of these children are smaller. And therefore, that level of malnutrition induces an element of traumatic brain injury and failure to thrive in the future. And so, for every 10,000 population in Gaza, there is one adult that is dying of these non-traumatic injuries, and there are 2 children who are dying every 10,000 population of these non-traumatic injuries. I now move on to the destruction of the social. And for me, this is the point where there's a divergence between a genocide and a war, even a brutal war. Because a war uses violence against the present to try to shape the future. And a genocide uses violence to end the present, erase the past, in order to prevent the future from ever coming into fruition. And so we see that 90 to 95% of school buildings in Gaza were destroyed. 651 teachers were killed, and another 2,790 were wounded. 17 institutions of higher education completely destroyed, of which 12 were universities. And 95 university professors, academics were killed. Again, in a targeted killing, when you look at the number of those academics killed as a percentage of the total number of academics and compare them to other professions, you see how these were targeted killings of a profession. 13 public libraries were destroyed. 19 of the 60 cemeteries were completely destroyed and their contents becoming unidentifiable. And the reason for that from the very beginning is to ensure that those who would survive have nothing to go back to Gaza, including the remnants of their loved ones. And 200 historical sites, archives, and libraries of rare books were completely destroyed. And this was happening October 2023, November 2023, from the very beginning of the war. 828 mosques and 3 churches were also destroyed. But that destruction of the social being, or the social dimension of the biosphere, includes 39,000 orphans, of whom 16,000 lost both parents, 17,000 widowed women, and the highest number of amputees per capita in the world. 300 sniper-induced spinal injuries through the use of quadcopters, the majority of whom under the age of 21. And 20% of the wounded have become physically disabled in one shape or form. So of the 100,000, 20% will be left with some disability. And 2,200 families wiped out the civil register, which means that the grandchildren, the parents, and the grandparents were killed. And so there is no lineage in that family that's left. What is crucial to understand is that if the war were to stop today, that biosphere will continue to take away the lives of Palestinians, because Israel has created intentionally these conduits of injury and killing that are able to sustain themselves independently unless they are dismantled independently, unless everything is taken apart. And so, in order to undo the damage, every aspect of life that was destroyed in Gaza needs to be rebuilt. And as I alluded to, the consequences, the health consequences of all of these injuries, not just the physical injuries and the biological injuries, but even the social injury, will take generations to undo. So this begs the question, why did Israel need to end the ceasefire? Why did Israel need to restart the genocide in this spectacular way if it ensured that the genocide can continue without the bombing? Well, I mean, in my opinion, there is something about violence in settler colonial projects that is performative. There needs to be gratuitous, openly non-utilitarian use of violence. You know, what Fanon described settler colonialism as violence in its pure form. And that is why Israel could not allow a silent genocide. It needs to perform. Israel needed to perform the killing of premature babies in the pediatric hospital and leave their bodies on a stretcher, because there's a performative need in settler colonialism that aims at convincing itself and the indigenous population of its complete omnipotence. It's almost deity-like omnipotence of taking life and allowing to live and allowing to die, and using violence beyond its utilitarian need, beyond the security and the military, into using violence for violence sake as a performance. And that is what we're seeing. That is what we saw on the day after the Americans negotiated the release of the dual citizenship Israeli hostage. Israel needed to send a message that violence in itself can be non-utilitarian. Itself is the aim. That exhibition of bombing a hospital that it knew very well was full of foreign medical teams. It needs to be seen performing, one, the omnipotence of violence, and two, to exercise on its victims the impunity of this godlike violence. That I will perform to you, I will tell you what I'm going to do, I will perform the violence for no reason other than violence sake, because it is critical that you are aware of my omnipotence and my impunity. So, on the anniversary of the beginning of the Nakba as a process, and how we find ourselves crossing the genocidal Rubicon, one of the things that we need to try to do as those who can read back in history is to try to understand the genocidal roots of the Zionist settler project from the very beginning. That it was a land without a people because the Palestinians, for the Zionists, were unseen. And when unseen, your killing becomes easier. It was a land without a people because by ensuring that Palestinian labor was completely kept out of the Zionist economy, it made sure that genocide was going to be easier, unlike places like South Africa, where the labor was a critical component. And we now have crossed that genocidal Rubicon. And the question is, what we know from Canada, what we know from the United States, what we know from Australia, is that these settler colonial projects, once they cross the genocidal Rubicon, they're unable to come back. And so the Canadians continued to kill native children into the 70s and 80s in the residential schools. The Australians continued to try to kill the Aborigines into the 80s by poisoning their wells. There's now a Rubicon that has been crossed, and we see the beginnings of it being practiced in the West Bank, and then very soon inside 1948, of this genocidal logic of the settler colonial project. So thank you very much, and I will end here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Ghassan, for this illuminating and very difficult to hear lecture, but it's also a somber look on reality. I thought, so we're going to open the door for this discussion now. So if you have a question, please raise your hand, identify yourself, and address your question to Professor Ghassan. Maybe before to let the audience warm up, I can ask you the question. I remember in November 2023, you told me that the difference between your previous experiences in Gaza and elsewhere, as in conflict zones or war zones, and this time, which is a genocide, is one of a tsunami. What did you mean by that?
It's about so what I felt was that the difference between a war, even a bad war, even the 2014 war in Gaza, or the Yemen war, or Mosul, and this war was the difference between a flood and a tsunami. It's the scale and the continuity of it is what is different. You feel a wave that doesn't end of death and destruction on a scale that you have never seen, and that completely dwarfs anything that you can imagine or prepare for. I mean, the Palestinian health system in Gaza had, over the years, since 2009, the war in 2009, and then 2012 and 2014 and 21, and the marches of return, had prepared itself better for wars. And it had prepared for a war. But nothing on this scale. Shifa Hospital could not possibly prepare for 800 wounded coming in after a single air raid. And the other thing that was different is this idea that is now, and I think not enough attention has been given to it, the destruction of the health system, the systematic destruction, the destruction of buildings, of human resources, of medication, of all aspects of human health, is now a central tenet of the Israeli military doctrine. And when you think about it, when we first started to hear about scorched earth policy in the 60s and 70s in Korea and Vietnam, and it was when the world's population lived mainly in the countryside. But now that the world's population is mainly urban, scorched earth necessitates the destruction of the health system in order to make a place uninhabitable. An urban lived environment can only become uninhabitable if you completely dismantle the health system.
The other question I wanted to ask you, you criticized the work of the humanitarian NGOs as well as the international bodies working in Gaza. And you said that we need a different form of humanitarianism, an alternative form of humanitarianism. Can you elaborate on that?
So I think if we think about the evolution of this current form of humanitarianism that started in the early 70s and then moved until it became a justification for imperialist occupation interventions, we see that it's based on this idea that the job of the humanitarian sector is only to address the consequences of ill justice. And this idea that humanitarianism should be apolitical, otherwise it betrays itself, rather than siding with the oppressed and, more importantly, ending the causes of ill health. I mean, the whole idea in medicine is that you need to prevent ill health, and in these circumstances, the ill health is the occupation and settler colonialism. And so what you have is charity. And what you need is solidarity. Solidarity with the people there. Solidarity through the provision of health care. What you want is to undo the causes of ill health in Palestine, which is the occupation and which is the settler colonial project. And the idea, and what we're now, as a consequence, and I think it's that evolution of humanitarianism, is now the American proposal, where you have a humanitarian concentration camp, where people are allowed to walk to one of 3 feeding sites, collect food just enough for 2 weeks, and then walk back, while the genocide is continuing. And so, I mean, it is my belief that this war will mark the end of the humanitarian sector as we see it. And that sector needs to basically decide whether it needs to become more or return to the pre-70s model of liberation medicine, of being part of a struggle for against settler colonialism and imperialism, rather than an attempt to treat the symptoms only of these injustices.
Any questions? Yes, please. So we have a mic here. Daniel will give you in a second.
My name is Ali Fahmi. I'm an epidemiologist at London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. You provided very detailed numbers. For example, if I'm not wrong, 30% higher risk of mothers dying. Risk of miscarriage, if I'm not wrong. This is very detailed, and many other numbers. I'm sure they are from somewhere. Where they are from, are they available? Have you written them? Can I find them myself?
They're all from UN agencies. They're all publicly available statistics. All of them are publicly available. I mean, this is the most documented, captured on image genocide in the history of humanity. And that's one of the things that I think amplifies our moral failure, is that we've watched this unfold for 18 months and we failed to stop it unfolding.
Sorry, I just wanted to mention that I haven't done my research, so I'm not I'm not working on this humanitarian area. If I may ask,
if you follow, there's a UN organization called OCHA, OCHA, in the OPT, in the occupied territories, and they have a weekly update where they collect all this information in the humanitarian aspects and the developments in the West Bank as well as Gaza. So briefly, yes, please. Another question.
The second question, I was following your talks and when you were in Gaza, and it was devastating to me here. How would you kept yourself then or now mentally healthy? I am myself struggling. That's a very personal question.
Thank you.
I think, well, first of all, you have your ups and downs, but you have to tell yourself that people out there do not have the luxury of you giving up. And therefore, you shouldn't have the luxury of giving up. Your colleagues out there, your colleagues that are in prison, do not have the luxury of you stopping. And the genocide is continuing. And that's the most difficult thing. The most difficult thing is being able to coexist with a world that is allowing this to continue. That's the most difficult aspect of everything that those of us who are now outside have grappled with. How do you belong to organizations, professional organizations, that you now know have become complicit in the enablement of genocide? How do you continue to have any kind of regard for academic institutions or professional institutions that have proven themselves to be part of the state and tools of power of the state? How do you function in a society where you've discovered there is no civil society because all of the unions have been effectively either neutered or co-opted, and all of those, you now understand what the 70s and 80s and 90s did to this country. That kind of evisceration of those societal structures that are able in any way to mount a challenge, even something as grave as not complicity, but participation, active participation in the genocide.
I think part of the problem with how you identified the roll call of statistics is that the externalities of the war is actually really even just starts off with the truth, right? Related to whether or not there is genocide, whether or not there is famine. And the fact that you have one person saying the sky is red, the other person saying the sky is blue, and the externalities of what we're dealing with right now actually is beyond the health and the trauma, is actually the level of acceptability of truths related to our public sphere. And that's something that is not just in the locality of Gaza. Obviously, it extends far beyond. So I think, dealing with the health issue is like there's a public health issue, there's a mental health issue. But there are different levels of it. Which I think are very difficult. When you mentioned Rubicon, the only thing that I was thinking of was the fact that when you compare South Africa, actually the Rubicon speech that Botha gave was actually when the Afrikaners decided finally the country was not going to be theirs and that Mandela was going to be released. So in a way, the only hope I guess we have right now in the coming weeks is that it is a Rubicon. That actually it's a Rubicon where we actually decide that it's enough and that it stops and we scale back to restoring rights to the Palestinians. But then but to your point though, I think there's a bifurcation in terms of what happens to the population. Either it goes the way of Native Americans or of the indigenous Aborigines in Australia, or it goes to the South Africans or Cambodia or Vietnam, where those people are still there. And those populations recover, even with all of the waste and all of the biological waste and all of the trauma and everything else they had to deal with. Those populations in decades, as you say, but they're still here in some visible form of what they were before all of those wars. In a way that obviously in Australia and in America we don't see that. So my question, I guess, is to what extent that sort of bifurcation in terms of which way the population is going to go when we see beyond this is who's doing that work.
Thank you.
So one of the reasons I think behind the creation of the biosphere is to reach some magical number of irrecoverability for Palestinians in Gaza. So at the moment, Israel has killed 14% of the population. To give that some historical comparison, France lost 4% of its population during the Second World War. So that's the extent. And I think the Israelis are looking for some magical number. And this is not me kind of extrapolating, because actually Benny Morris spoke about 60% of the population. So one of the examples he gave when he talked about in his Haaretz articles in the 90s about the historical mistake of the Zionist movement in leaving some of the indigenous population there, he said that the reason why other settler colonial projects were much more successful is that they had broken that 40 to 60% ceiling of genocidal erasure, which makes a population unrecoverable.
So we have one more question in the back. Shall we take two questions this time?
Yeah.
Okay, and then another one here. Yeah. On the side, yes.
Ghassan, you managed to make me depressed, and that's not easy, okay? I just want to address this question, okay? The main thing about the Palestinians is that they're not like any other people in this world. You know, it might sound illogical, but that's a fact. If you take Gaza, Gaza is one section of Palestinians under occupation. You still got West Bank, which is also under occupation. Then you have got those living within the Green Line. They are still Palestinians. But don't forget, you have about 7-8 million Palestinians living in refugee camps all over the Middle East, 58 of them. So I am trying to work out how Israel is going to deal with all of this. But that's not my job, okay? Our job is to say, how are we going to make sure the Palestinians are going to recover? And when there's a chance to recover, where are we? You know, I think so far, the Palestinians in Gaza have borne this horrible, horrible thing with all the courage that's never been seen before. And that's a fact. All right? And it is how we are going to bear that as well. And I'm at that point when I'm wanting to go, wanting to feel horrible, but yet every day there will be a new thing which gives me hope. You talk about the amputees. I will answer you with the Gaza sunbirds. You talk about the destruction of all the trees in Gaza. I want to remind you of an old man that after 40 days of torture by Israel and the destruction of his farm, ordered 1,200 olive trees to be replanted. You talk about murder and genocide. I want to remind you of the Palestinian children who never look back, and they are what is going to rebuild Palestine. The toxicity of the environment is a physical problem that's very difficult to deal with.
Can you please wrap it up so we can
yes, I'm going to wrap it up. Yeah, so Ghassan, I want to answer this question. How do we detoxify the biosphere?
Thank you. Did you have also a question or just you were raising your hand? No, you. Yeah.
Thank you very much. It is bleak, but it's really important because the genocide has awakened people around the world. And I think that all over the world, people now know what Palestine is, what they stand for, their resilience, their steadfastness, their resistance. And I think our duty in Britain is to build that movement against racism, against imperialism, and that is our solidarity with the Palestinian people, because the Labour Party, the Tories, whoever's in power, they are responsible, and not just in the last 18 months, but for decades and decades. And I wondered if you could just touch on anything to do with the role that we have outside of Palestine, and in Britain in particular.
Thank you. One more here, the young man. And then, do you need a pencil, Ghassan?
No.
Salam, Ghassan. I was just listening, and I heard about how you were talking about bomb casings having selenium in it, and how it's causing all sorts of havoc and causing diseases like hepatitis and polio. And you mentioned some abnormalities that I don't think we've ever seen in these cases, like hypertension in children. I myself have seen a child who wasn't even a teenager and had hair loss from all the stress she was induced by. I kind of want to know, will we see in time to come children growing into adults with these long-lasting diseases that couldn't be treated because of all the toxins in Gaza? Are we going to see the next generation with mutations? What's the future for these people? Also, I want to say,
we can come back to you later if you want. Yeah. Thank you very much, Ghassan.
So you literally have to. I mean, the importance for me of looking into and thinking about the biosphere as a framework is to ensure that people realize that you have to undo each conduit of injury. So if you look at and think of the health system, that it's not just the rebuilding of the hospitals, it's the retraining of the health workers, it's the rebuilding of the medical schools. It is a whole network approach rather than a single entry point approach. And it's the same with education, the same with agriculture, the same with every aspect of life in Gaza that has been taken apart. With regards to the outside, I think what we've seen is how the genocide has become the vehicle with which fascism has come back to power with a strength because of the moral failure of the liberal wing of the global ruling classes. And so that genocide has allowed, through the logic of brutalism of genocide, it has allowed the anti-humanist logic of fascism to take hold again and to be able to justify itself, because we have allowed that anti-humanist brutalism in front of us to continue for 18 months, and now having come back to power in lots of places and will continue to come back to power, the world realizes one of the roles of the genocide is an anti-humanist logic in dealing with surplus populations, whether they're surplus populations, politically surplus populations like the Palestinians, or socially surplus populations like the refugees being drowned in the Mediterranean, or economically surplus populations like the disabled in the UK who are now going to be denied healthcare and welfare. All of that brutalism and anti-humanism is all, I think, linked to the performative nature of this genocide in allowing that logic to take hold and become acceptable. It's acceptable for you know, it's the entertaining thing is when people are shocked that a genocide supporting prime minister might say racist things like an island of strangers, as if being a genocide supporter isn't morally repugnant enough that becomes not a cause for surprise when he does add on that insult. Now, with regards to the future, there's no doubt in my mind that when we talk about what next for Gaza, what we're failing to ask is what next for Zionism, because now there is a political ideology that has nothing to offer other than killing. It has, there's no component left within Zionism other than genocidal killing. And therefore, I think one of the reasons why the war continued until it did, the genocide continued until it did, is Netanyahu and the political elite in Israel's realization that there was nowhere else to go, and that the only thing keeping the lid on this historical cul-de-sac that they've reached is a continued genocide, is the erasure of Palestinians.
Okay, I'm going to take 3 more questions. Did you still have a question on the side, the gentleman with the grey hair? You still have a question? No? Okay, so one here, another there, please. So I'm going to take hands, and there's another hand up there as well.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Abu Sittah, for this, for your lecture. I wanted to ask a question about impunity, and from a legal point of view, we can have an analysis of how impunity functions in settler colonies, right? So, and this is commemorating Nakba Day, so it's very clear how impunity is baked right into a settler colonial legal system. But I wanted to ask you if you could speak a little bit more about, in your view, from a medical maybe point of view as well, how you see the effects of impunity on people who are having to live with this degree of impunity intergenerationally, and then in this particular moment when impunity seems to be looming even larger, right? And I agree with your analysis of the performative function of impunity. But if you could just maybe elaborate a little bit more on the effects on people having to live with the kind of impunity we see being performed now.
So, I mean, I think physically and in terms of mental health, it's like it allows for the perpetuation of the injury in a way that prevents healing in any shape or form. And so in a generation, in 2 generations' time, these wounds are not historical wounds, they are ever present, because they were kept present by the absence of any sense of justice. And the question then comes is how, not just that, how do the impunity, how it affects the victims, but also how it will affect the societies and the countries that were complicit in ensuring the impunity. Impunity is not Israeli. That's the part of the deal between the settler colony and the metropole, is that I do your killing and you provide the impunity that I need. And therefore, what that impunity means in terms of the ability of these countries and these societies to function, knowing and what we know now, we know is only a small percentage of what we will find out when this genocide is ever over, the details, the stories that will come out, that the Israelis are trying to keep a lid on by preventing the media going in, trying to suppress this enablement and the silencing apparatus that exists to try to stop these stories. And so the erosion of these societies and these countries that have ensured the impunity, because impunity doesn't come from the Israelis. The Israelis want to tell you about the impunity that the metropole, the Western metropole, is affording them, because they are its tool with which they bludgeon the indigenous people.
There were two hands here. Which one? Yes. Sorry, go ahead. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. Dr. Ghassan, I was just wondering, how do we deal with the increasing McCarthyism inside state institutions, such as the NHS, when healthcare workers who criticize the genocide, even outside the workplace, risk losing their career and livelihoods as precedents to shut down any critique of Zionism? For example, the case of Dr. Nadim Krau, a British Jordanian doctor who was suspended from his NHS job and is currently taking his employer to tribunal. Thank you.
So one more hand up there, please.
It's so saddening and depressing to hear everything today and to hear it every single day on social media, in the news. And one of the things I think I don't understand why this doesn't get highlighted is that the role of Hamas. Because, as I know it, Israel set up Hamas, initially funded them, and has, and a lot of the things about Hamas seems to be that they are the excuse that keeps on giving. As long as they are there, the justification for this bombing will continue. And yet Hamas do not seem to understand what is happening to the people there. And they let an American go the other day and got nothing for it. I do not understand this. If your people are in this situation of genocide, even the Japanese, when the bomb got dropped, they surrendered because they knew that's the annihilation of our people. Why don't they stop? There were lots of demonstrations in Gaza, demonstrations against Hamas. They put them down. They do not allow the Palestinians to speak.
Thank you. One more here, please. And then we'll allow you a chance to answer the 3 questions in the next round, please. Moshe.
Thank you. My question is really about hospitals. But before I ask, I want to say that you're right, that it's very difficult to find another genocide to compare this to. I'm a researcher on the Holocaust, and I remember that the Jewish hospital in Berlin remained open for 6 years of the Second World War. Just a bit of statistics. The same is true about the Jewish hospital in Vienna. Now, I was speaking on a genocide panel a few months ago. A Palestinian surgeon that was speaking on the panel told us a very depressing story, and I would like to ask your view about this. I didn't know what he knew. He told us that the British and the American hospitals that were built about a year ago cost tens of millions of pounds and never took a single patient in. The way he described it, which is really shocking, is these were done for the shots from the drone, to show people in the West that America and Britain are actually doing something. And then he added that they actually employed 60 doctors and nurses in the American hospital, but not a single patient was treated. So they actually reduced the people that could actually help people in Gaza by employing people without a function. This raises the question of the day after, when how can we actually believe and trust the US, UK, and Europe if this is how they treated the medical facilities that they themselves built?
Thank you.
And will probably want to build others later on.
Thank you. Please.
So with regards to the McCarthyism, for me, the McCarthyism, it's very difficult to measure objectively changes in political opinion and mobilization and political change. But I always use oppression as a metric to measure the seriousness of political change. And so it is that McCarthyism that allows us to understand the extent to which there has been a seismic change in the narrative with regards to Palestine, with regards to the Palestinians, with regards to Israel and its relationship with the West, with regards to Western imperialism. And the way we measure this change is by measuring oppression as a metric, trying to prevent this political change. As someone who's on their second case at the General Medical Council to have my medical license taken away, the way I view it is, on the days that I get emails from the General Medical Council or from my lawyers, is that I tell myself that my friend Adnan al-Burj had a broomstick shoved up his ass and then bled to death in his cell. And that anything these institutions that are part of the genocide project do to me pales into comparison to what they have done to my colleagues. With regards to Hamas, we are old enough to remember, actually very old enough to remember, pre-1988. And the same discourse was used against the PLO. If only the PLO would disappear, the Palestinian people would flourish. If only the PLO would withdraw from Beirut in '82, the Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon would flourish. And we saw that immediately within days of the PLO withdrawing from Beirut, the Sabra and Shatila massacres happened. The thing about what I'm trying to explain to you is that settler colonialism is a structure. Violence is a structure. It is the blood that courses the veins of settler colonialism. And that violence will continue regardless of when the liberals of the Labour Party in Israel were in power or the Ben Gvir and the hard right was in power. The killing is not for Hamas. The killing is to erase the Palestinians. The Native Americans were wiped out not because they had the wrong leadership. They were wiped out because they were the indigenous population. People in Africa were killed because they are the indigenous population. Settler colonialism, the relationship between the Palestinians as the indigenous population and white European settler colonial Zionism, is based on the logic of elimination. That is why Israel attacked cemeteries. It is because the settler mentality cannot even bear to think about the dead.
Please allow our speaker
because
to speak.
In '82 it did not take away the 3,500 Palestinians who were butchered in Sabra and Shatila were butchered when the PLO did exactly what you said. And they left. The Palestinians accepted the Arab demands in 1936 and stopped their revolution against the British. And what happened? They lost their country as a result of stopping their resistance. The resistance,
Excuse me.
The resistance is the reason why things do not happen. It's not the reason why things happen. docile populations are wiped out much easier when they are unable to resist. The idea that resistance is what brings the wrath of the settler, and that so where is Hamas in the West Bank? The West Bank, Israel has the most acquiescent, supine Palestine Authority leadership with 70,000 security men at the service of the Israelis. Today, Israel captured 5 Palestinians and then executed them, and set fire to one of them inside a house and then bulldozed the house on top of his head. There are 50,000 Palestinians who have been made internally displaced through the destruction of Jenin camp, of Tulkarim camp, of the camps in Nablus. The Palestinian villages are continuously being attacked in the West Bank when there is supine acquiescence and collusion by the Palestine Authority. Palestinians in 1948 are attacked. Their villages are demolished under superfluous administrative zoning laws because they have lost the ability to defend themselves.
Shall we take another round of questions? Humanitarian sector.
So I fully agree with you, and this is what I mean about the fact that the humanitarian sector has, the Americans through the PEER project and through IMC have managed to humanitarianize the genocide. And the plan, this new Trump plan, is a humanitarianizing the genocide. I.e., you cannot, the idea is that as long as you're feeding people and you're not starving them embarrassingly on TV, you can continue the genocide in a much more pleasant way. And the humanitarian sector has allowed itself to become complicit in that process.
One and two.
Professor Ghassan, thank you. Rather than just being complicit...
Speak up, please.
Rather than just being complicit in what's happening in Gaza, etc., isn't it part of the biosphere? I'm talking about the international legal framework, the UN, humanitarians, unwittingly, perhaps... thinking that they can get on the inside and change the institution, but the institutions as they stand and their inability or ability to look away, they're part of the biosphere that needs dismantling.
And one more question here in the middle, please.
Hi. Thank you for the talk. Having witnessed the level of death and destruction that you personally witnessed in Gaza, and having all of us witness the level of impunity the Israelis have been enjoying, do you practically have any shred of hope deep inside you that something will change in the positive direction, at least in our lifetime? And if yes, how do you think that could happen or could be achieved?
There's another gentleman near you. If you can pass the microphone, just. So.
Yeah, hello. So question is sort of trying to think from our perspective over here. As a generation, we've grown up seeing film after film of Arab-looking people being killed, wiped out in war zones. We've grown up on countless video games, PlayStation, Xbox, all of this kind of thing of like killing people that look Arab, all of this sort of thing. I myself, as an Arab, I have sort of cultural and value-based attachment to opposing this genocide. But the vast majority of the population in this country, they simply interact with this genocide through the medium of social media. And it comes back to what the gentleman was talking about when it comes to truth. When we have seen so much on screens in front of us in this sort of fake format, i.e. film, TV, all of this sort of thing, when it really happens in front of us in that same format, i.e. on social media, on screens in front of us, I can't help but feel that there is a feeling that reality, there is a lack of sort of being able to square it up truly as reality. So I'm trying to really understand for myself, how can this become real for people that don't have a sort of pre-existing attachment, that just see this happening in front of them and have grown up on all this other stuff and just see everything happen? I think I've made my question clear.
Thank you.
So, I mean, this war has been so fundamental to Western imperialism, is that it lit up the system. It's an event that lit up the system. Didn't not just light up the system in terms of those institutions of power that exists everywhere, and the relationship between universities in the UK and the research centers and Israeli manufacturing of weapons, and researchers in MIT working on the quadcopter drones. All of the system lit up. And what was also lit up is we see what we understand from settler colonial studies is the seamless continuum where there is no point where Western imperialism ends and Israel starts. That continuum of the relationship between the metropole and the settler colony, through which it is British planes flying out of Cyprus that are providing 60% of the electronic surveillance. It is Italian refueling planes that allowed the Israelis to bomb Yemen by refueling them mid-air. It is the Labour government's today there was a figure, the Labour government exported more weapons to Israel in the last 3 months than the Conservatives did in the whole of 23-24. It is all of these things, and that allows us to reassess this idea of the role of Western imperialism in this genocide, rather than a misguided or even partly complicit partner, but actually a critical component of the genocidal killing machine. Now, with regards, at the end of the day, what I'm saying to you is this. The genocide, by allowing it to continue, has already come home to roost, in the kind of Malcolm X chickens have come home to roost analogy. That genocide and its logic is now triggering a set of accepted norms within public debate in the West that have brought racial superiority, ideas of xenophobia, xenophobic nationalism, to respectability in a way that couldn't have happened without the genocide. And therefore, people need to be defending themselves here in order to defend the Palestinians there. The idea that we can sit here safely while making moral decisions about which side of the genocide we can sit is false. The genocide has come back to you. The erosion of international law has now blown back into the erosion of national laws. Very few people know this, but actually there is a law in the UK prohibiting people from joining an army at war if they're British citizens. Yet that law has been suspended so that those who want to join the Israeli army can join the Israeli army with impunity. That erosion of the rule of law is coming back to bite societies that have failed to stop the genocide. We're now witnessing the second blowback of the genocide, which are the changes that are coming, which are coming in these societies here. One of the central ideas in a lot of African American anti-racist literature and writings is the idea of racist unseeing. So they unsee you as an active process rather than an omission. It is not an omission that they unsee you as human, that they unsee the genocide that is unfolding in front of them on their screens. It is an active process in which you unsee people. You unsee people of color. You know, the reason why white settlers described the colonies as terra nullis, you know, empty lands, a land without a people, which is what the Zionists described people, I think is because they couldn't see you. They couldn't see you as human beings. I mean, therein lies one of the kind of core seeds of the genocide, is that from the very beginning they could not see you as human beings, and so the land did appear to them as empty. And so unseeing is a critical component, and that comes back to the idea that these things are interlinked, that the performative killing in a dehumanizing way of Palestinians, of people of color, has had the effect of furthering the agenda of white supremacist ideologies in the West.
Thank you. Shall we take one or more question? One, and then two.
Thank you, Dr. Ghassan, for your holistic perspective on explaining this genocide. While you are talking, I'm thinking, while you're speaking, I'm thinking how to translate some of what you're saying into political activism. As a political activist, I want to take this away and do something with it. And one particular thing that you talked about briefly today was the change in our approach to humanitarianism. And only yesterday I was at the lobby day lobbying my MP. And for the last year and a half, he responds to me with humanitarian gestures. And yesterday I got really fed up with his sort of responses. And I said, these are the questions I would like you to answer. And I do not want you to say one more humanitarian, I feel sorry for the victims, I will do this and that. And I think from today, from listening to you today, I would really like some kind of follow-up reflective thinking about how we present humanitarian arguments within a political activist way.
Thank you. So, final question here.
I really appreciated your diagnosis of the humanitarian industrial complex, and at best being a plaster over gaping toxic wounds, and at worst a pretext for intervention and continued imperialist aggression and enforcing carceral logics on already occupied people. You mentioned liberation medicine from the 60s, and I wondered if you could meditate a little bit on envisioning what it would look like for medicine holistically to take a more militant and political approach in our current moment and moving forward. And as there is a consciousness growing of the futility and the perniciousness of humanitarianism, what that infrastructure looks like at a local level and perhaps at a global level as well.
So one of the interesting things about modern Palestinian history is that the provision of healthcare as an act of resistance played a disproportionate part in Palestinian liberation movement than most other movements, including South Africa. the Palestine Red Crescent Society was a founding component of the PLO. Palestinian health workers were present as a critical component of the Palestinian revolution in the 70s and 80s, and then during the first and second intifadas, we had the growth of these grassroots organizations like the medical relief committees and the Union of Health Work committees that were part of the intifada. And I think it's a recognition about the critical role that necropolitics and the politics of death play in Israeli settler colonial politics, and that the antithesis to these politics of death is the politics of life and healing and provision of health care. And I think even before people had a name for necropolitics, there was a kind of almost implicit acceptance that this is what Israel is doing, i.e. creating these death worlds for Palestinians. Initially in the 60s and 70s in the refugee camps of Lebanon and then in Palestine. The way this looks is very simple, and it's easily translatable. You put yourself at the service of the people that you are there to serve. In terms of Gaza, that's the Ministry of Health. You go and you say to the Ministry of Health, let me, under your guidance, provide you with the specialists and the resources to help you continue your work, as opposed to intentionally use the provision of healthcare to take away sovereignty. You see, the problem with the humanitarian sector is it does not believe in sovereignty of the indigenous population that it pertains to serve. And anything that dilutes the sovereignty of the Palestinian people is not in the interest of the Palestinian people. And health sovereignty, more so for Palestinians, as I explained, is a critical component of Palestinian individual sovereignty and national sovereignty. And therefore the control of Palestinian health by Palestinians is what is done. And as the gentleman said, the Ministry of Health in Gaza has not been able to pay salaries. And so what these NGOs did is they came and offered $2,000, $3,000 salaries for doctors to leave the Ministry of Health hospitals and stay in these field hospitals that at best had 1 or 2 operating rooms, at best because of all of the different stipulations they had, would operate on 3 or 4 patients at the time when 60, 70 mass casualty patients would arrive at a Palestinian hospital on a slow day. And so anything, and the provision of healthcare, I believe, is critical, that takes away from national sovereignty and from societal sovereignty, is an enemy of that people. It is not an ally of that people. And the humanitarian sector does that. It denies sovereignty. You become a beneficiary, not an ally. And what you want is an ally. You want to support your allies in the struggle, not your beneficiaries in the struggle. It's the same, when Tony Blair came and told us in the National Health Service that you are our patients, you are our clients. There's a difference between clients and patients. There's a difference between allies and beneficiaries.
Thank you so much for this wide-ranging and illuminating conversation. Thank you all for coming. Stay tuned for other events by the Center for Palestine Studies. Please help me in thanking Professor Ghassan Abu-Sittah. I wish the lights were better on the stage, but can we do it again with the lights?